Καλημέρα σε όλους σας. Θα ξεκινήσουμε ευθύς αμέσως στο πάνελ. Ευθύς αμέσως στην...
Thank you very much. I'd like to wish all of you a very good morning. I'll give the floor to Mrs. Kuneva first, so she can give you some brief introductory words, and then I'll give the floor to Mr. Hadji Georgiou. They are the two initiators of this event today. Mrs. Kuneva. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to wish you all a very warm welcome. I'd like to thank everyone who's taken up our invitation to attend this event today. I'd like to thank the speakers and the guests. And you'll all have an opportunity to express your different positions and to hear reports from people's experiences. This is an event that I proposed last year in the GUI group, and together with Takis Hadji Georgiou, we have been organizing this event. Well, the word child, I think that makes all of us feel sensitive, whether we're parents ourselves or not. Well, I'd be pleased if this kind of sensibility that we all feel when we talk about children could expand more broadly in our society, particularly to those places where such children live. But unfortunately, children live in a world today that is characterized by terrible violence, and that even applies to some countries within Europe. I'll give you an example. Greece has made an agreement with Turkey so that Turkey, to the extent possible, can keep refugees within Turkey and not send them to Europe. This is a very problematic agreement for many reasons, but one of the main reasons for the problems is that refugee children are suffering under this agreement. I'm wondering whether anyone has paid any attention to the conditions in which these children are living in Turkey. Recently we saw a broadcast on the news about the conditions under which these children are living. These are children who should be going to school. Europe is now acting as if it had solved the problem. But has Europe really shown a civilized face to the world? We simply cannot look on in silence. We have our share in the guilt of when we're talking about the conflict in Syria. So today we'll have an opportunity to hear from experts, from activists, and also people from the academic world. They'll try and shed some light on all of the problems that have emerged in protecting children's rights in Europe. Unfortunately, it's not only a problem for refugee children. The entire European system for protecting children is experiencing major problems. There are victims of trafficking, and there are children who have to go through long drawn-out court cases when their parents separate. There are also children out there who are forced into child labour to produce the products that Europe is consuming. Before I move on to the individual speakers, could I just briefly note that for reasons which we're not responsible for, we only have interpreting until 11 o'clock this morning, not 12 o'clock as was originally announced. So for that reason, we'll try and be very disciplined in our use of time. We want to ensure that all of the speakers get enough time to speak in their own language. So we've got to try and get it over by 11 o'clock, then we'll have debate. I'll now hand over to Mr. Hadji Georgiou. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kostadinka. Good morning to you. I'd like to start by thanking Mrs. Kuneva's staff. They have done a lot of their hard work of actually getting this conference organized. Today there are quite a number of different events going on in the European Parliament, I think there's at least 12 different conferences at the moment, but there's one particularly important that's going on today is this one. I think this is the most important one. I don't simply want to blow my own trumpet, but I think it's a fact. Today we are dealing with a topic that should be exercising every single person on this planet. That's to say, our children. Those who would close doors and simply ignore what's going on, I think that we have to remember it's not just a job for the institutions. It's not just a job for countries like Turkey and the member states. It's a job for everyone to try and protect the rights of children. I'm hoping for a very productive, constructive meeting today. I hope that there will be a good follow-up to it as well. I hope that we can send a message to the outside world at the end of this conference so that we can mobilize citizens and institutions so that everybody can get involved. Normal men and women on the streets, doctors, people out in society. People need to have their eyes open to understand what's actually going on around them. We really need to keep our eye on what is going on so that we can react and react in whatever manner we can. Those are my introductory remarks. As I say, there are quite a lot of events going on today in the European Parliament. Unfortunately, that means we don't have a lot of time available to us. I would like to say that we only ever deal with important subjects, but I mean, honestly, we do occasionally deal with less important ones. But today, there's quite a lot going on. There's a meeting of the General Secretariat of my own party here in the Parliament. I'm going to have to be involved in that meeting myself. So unfortunately, I won't have a constant presence here in the room. But otherwise, I'm looking forward to a very lively debate today.
Τώρα δίνω το λόγο στον κύριο Παπαδημούλη, ο οποίος έχει έρθει.
Mr. Papadimoulis has the floor next. He's only just come into the room, so I'd like to welcome him to the room. He'll get the floor first of all. Well, I don't think I'm actually on the programme, Kostadinka, but I'll just keep my remarks very brief. I'd like to thank you for the initiative that you've taken with Takis. And as a member of the GUI NGL group, and as a Vice Chair of the European Parliament, Vice President of the European Parliament rather, I just wanted to say that I am carefully involved in the Committee Against Discrimination. So protection of children, protection of the rights of children is one of my top priorities. Unfortunately, it's not a subject that's being taken up by the official policies of the European Union, but that's why I think that precisely this initiative is so important, so that we can hear from experts. And I hope that the debate that we hold today will exert some pressure to ensure that things sound nice in fine words on paper are actually implemented in practice. I think there needs to be a constant effort so that we can work towards a situation where we can actually implement the provisions in the European constitutional treaties. At the moment, words and deeds are very much divided. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for passing on your remarks. This subject is indeed one that is not properly dealt with at the European level. It's a question for our future, so I think it's very it's absolutely unacceptable that the various bodies of the European Union are always compiling reports and talking about the rights of children, but they don't actually do anything in practice. Let's move on to the first panel. The title of this first panel is Children in Extreme Danger and Exploitation. The first speaker is Zoe Zakeliadou. She is here representing the EU Anti-Trafficking Coordinator. There are 20 million victims of human trafficking around the world, and more than 5 million of those are children. How do these children arrive in Europe, and how will you be working to deal with the issue of unaccompanied minors arriving as refugees? So I'm certainly going to be looking forward to listening to Mrs. Zakeliadou's remarks. I'm sure she'll have a lot of interesting information for us. I'd like to thank her for attending once again, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us. We've met representatives of a number of organisations, including the EU Commission's Anti-Trafficking Office. This office is indeed very active. It works very rapidly. It's got a lot of very committed staff, so you pursue very useful goals as well. Mrs. Kuneva, thank you very much for your very friendly words of welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, parliamentarians, I'd like to start by thanking you for having invited me to speak to you today, but I will be speaking English, even if Greek is my mother tongue.
Gentlemen, I would like to warmly thank the European Parliamentary Group of the European United Left and the Northern Green Left, and the Honourable Members Takis Hantsigeorgiou and Konstantin Kakouneva for the honouring invitation. Most importantly, I would like to thank this Parliament for the keen interest and commitment not only to address trafficking in human beings, but also to put as a priority the issue of child trafficking. I represent the Office of the EU Anti-Trafficking Coordinator, Dr. Miria Vassiliadou, at the European Commission, who has a horizontal mandate entrusted with promoting the coordination and the coherence of EU anti-trafficking policies inside the Commission, within the EU institutions, among the EU member states, but also the external dimension of trafficking in human beings. But before I go further, I would like to use this opportunity to use my voice for the voiceless, for the child victims of trafficking in human beings that cannot attend conferences like that. A 14-year-old Estonian girl with disabilities was sexually exploited and abused by a large group of men from the neighborhood and was later forced into prostitution in neighboring towns, despite the widespread knowledge among the local community. It took more than 2 years to acknowledge the situation by the local authorities and start an investigation. A report by the Rotherham Borough Council found that between 1997 and 2013, at least 1,400 children, some as young as 11, were trafficked to other cities in England. The authorities and the wider community were found to have known, but have failed to act. A 15-year-old orphan from Uganda was found trafficked in the Netherlands. She was brought from a refugee camp by a man promising her a normal life. In the Netherlands, the man handed her over to 2 other men who put her in a house where more girls resided, and they were forced into sexual exploitation. Indeed, the European Union has challenging times ahead, and amidst the refugee crisis and the current migration situation, more people become vulnerable to unscrupulous networks of traffickers. Trafficking in human beings is often linked with migrant smuggling, child sexual exploitation, drug trafficking, cybercrime, terrorism, the list is long. But I think it's very important to highlight that child trafficking existed even before the migration and the refugee crisis. What is a fact is that the current situation exacerbates the vulnerabilities of these children. And let us be clear, what is trafficking of children? It's the buying and selling of these children like commodities in a market. It's the buying and selling of their abuse, of their services. And we should agree that children are the most vulnerable of all to traffickers. And here I would like to highlight the issue of demand, because we have many children in our societies, unfortunately, that are vulnerable. The question is why they fall victims. Why aren't they all victimized? And we should think of the issue of demand, particularly for children. Because behind every child victim, and I would kindly invite you to think about it, behind every child victim, there is not only a trafficker, but there is also someone who is soliciting, who is asking for the services of this child, for the products made out of this child, be it the sexual abuse of this child or, as the Honourable Member Ms. Kuneva mentioned earlier, products that were made from these children's hands. Someone is asking for the abuse of these children. And it is important that we stress that children are exploited for many different forms of trafficking: sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, sale of children, illegal adoptions. More and more we hear about, not related to not child trafficking per se, but related to surrogacy and how this links to trafficking, etc. And I am here today to share with you some of the findings of the first EU report, the EU Progress Report on trafficking in human beings, with a particular dimension on trafficking. What does the report indicate? Let me start by a very clear trend. We see a sharp increase in child trafficking reported across the EU. We have only 15,000, approximately 16,000 victims registered. This means that these are only the victims that come in contact with authorities. Can you imagine how many children are not able to be in contact with the authorities? We don't have such data yet, but we're working in the direction to make sure that we try to see and make the invisible visible. Now, what is interesting is that 65% of those victims that were registered are EU citizens. Does that mean that non-EU citizens are not EU victims? No. But we should start considering why can't we see non-EU citizens as high in our statistics as EU citizens. 76% of those people registered were women and girls, and at least 15,000 were children. For the period 2010 to 2012, we have approximately more than 1,000 children trafficked only for the purpose of sexual exploitation inside the EU. And we have reasonable grounds to believe that the current situation will show numbers increasing of victims. But what we see decreasing is the number of convictions, the number of prosecutions, and the number of investigations started against the traffickers of these children. The report highlights that the most reported form of trafficking is sexual exploitation, 67% of the registered victims. Interesting, a very strong gender dimension here. 95% of the victims of sexual exploitation are women and girls, followed by trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation at 21%, where here we see another clear gender dimension. 74% of these victims are men and boys. And we also hear from the member states and from the civil society, because to draft this report that I'm presenting to you today, we received input from the civil society, from the member states, from international organizations. They all agree that identifying children either at risk or already victimized is one of the most difficult tasks they have to face, and the question is why? We also hear that organized crime groups choose children because they are easy to recruit and quick to replace. And these are very harsh words I'm saying, but I am reproducing to you what the traffickers that are in this horrible business say. So they consider children easily replaceable, easy to catch, easy to recruit. They can also be kept under their control rather easily. And very often we hear that they can do their business discreetly, without a lot of noise. And for trafficked children between the ages of 6 months to 10 years, Europol informs us that there is a price tag. So you can get a child in the illegal market for 4,000 euros to 8,000 euros. At times, the price can go up to 40,000 euros. So I'm kindly asking you here to think of the profits that these people are making. Trafficking networks also target socially and economically disadvantaged families and push these families into debt, which they cannot repay. In this context, children are taken away from parents as a form of debt repayment. In some cases, we also hear that the families of children are playing an active role into their victimization and into their trafficking. Children are sold and traded to strangers or to other relatives who ensure they are exploited further into EU, channeling them into sexual abuse, begging, juvenile delinquency, forced criminality, while often depriving them of material welfare such as adequate nutrition or using psychological coercion. We also see an increase in child criminality. Children are used for petty theft, for drug muling, for other forms of crime. And we also hear that illegal adoptions are on the rise. While illegal adoptions as such are not always necessarily linked to trafficking, we do hear and we have information on data where they actually are. And we also have links and we hear about the institutionalization of children and how this renders them more vulnerable to trafficking. And we also hear that children go missing. Children from institutions, children from reception centers. And again, the question we should all be asking is why? Very often we also hear that particularly children with a Roma background are further victimized. And generally what we report is that children suffer secondary victimization, not only during criminal proceedings against the perpetrators where the situation or the measures are not child-specific, but we also hear and we report that children victims of trafficking are often treated as the criminals. And this is unacceptable. What we also hear, and it is a fact, is that often these children are instructed to claim they are adults, because this makes the life of the traffickers much easier. And allow me to come to the legal standards and echo the Vice President of the European Parliament in saying that we do have a good set of legal standards and a good policy framework. The question is it being implemented? And the Commission is at the disposal not only of this Parliament but also the Member States to ensure that we assist those interested in meeting their legal obligations. The Anti-Trafficking Directive has a set of beneficial provisions for children and child victims. I will not elaborate on that, but I have brought publications with me here today on the rights accorded to children, psychological protection, legal assistance, the right to stay in the country, not to be deported, the right to durable solutions, the right to be presumed as children when they claim to be so. And to address the issue of children going missing, we are currently working with the Fundamental Rights Agency as a deliverable of the EU anti-trafficking strategy. We are working in the direction of delivering guidance, practical guidance to authorities on treating cases of children, be it EU or non-EU children, in return or transfer procedures. And our aim is to bridge the gap between the child protection systems, the child protection authorities that should be working closely with the law enforcement, with the embassies, with consular staff, with border guards, to ensure that children are primarily treated as children, because this is very important. We also work with non-EU countries, and we try to build consistency when it comes to EU anti-trafficking policies and how they are reflected in our cooperation with non-EU countries such as Nigeria and other countries where we have a big caseload. But allow me to address and I will close by this, a very important issue that links to prevention, because when we speak about victims, it's already too late. And this is the question of demand. Our response must be comprehensive. On the one hand, we must ensure that we address the causes that make people vulnerable, the causes that make children vulnerable, be it gaps in our migration policies, be it gaps in our social protection policies, in our education policies. We must ensure that we treat people, victims, child victims, as rights holders, because they have a set of rights that must be upheld. And not only ensuring that people have the right, but they have access to these rights, ensuring that they can access those rights and realize them. But at the same time, we must target those who profit from trafficking in human beings. We must reduce the demand that drives this crime, because trafficking is a crime driven by huge profits, astronomical profits for the traffickers, and by the demand that fosters this. Only inside the EU we know that this illegal business, this criminal activity, renders profits of 2.5 billion euros annually. And we must follow this money, because trafficking brings money not only to the traffickers, it also brings money and profits to legal sectors engaged in illegal businesses, but it also brings money to legal sectors engaged in legal business. And the EU legislation creates a legal obligation on member states to reduce this demand that fosters all forms of exploitation. And this is also a question for all of us as individuals, as consumers, and as businesses. I will close by saying that trafficking is not a modern trend. There's nothing modern about it. It existed before. It's even worse now. And we have many challenges ahead, but we have good legal foundations if we want to use them. We are now assessing compliance by member states as the Commission to the directive, to the legal standards of the directive, and we will ensure that we pay due attention to the elements that relate to children and child protection in the directive. We are developing the new policy framework after 2016, and we had a series of consultations with member states, the civil society. We will take into consideration the reports of this Parliament. But it's time to ask the difficult questions, and I will close by asking us all, who profits, who benefits from the exploitation of others, and particularly children? What are we doing to ensure that we sufficiently target the criminals, the users, the profit makers? Who buys children or their services? And crucially, how do these astronomical profits fuel the demand for the use and abuse of these victims? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sakeliadou. I'd just like to briefly remind you that today's meeting is being web streamed. So if you have any friends or colleagues or anyone else that you want to tell about this event, you can follow it on the internet. Now, according to Europol, 26,000 unaccompanied minors have arrived in Europe. About 10,000 refugee children have disappeared. These figures are terrifying. Why is this happening at the same time as closure of borders? Mrs. Andrea Fonkerman from the UNHCR office in Brussels is the next speaker on our list. She is going to report back to us on this huge problem.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ, Πρόεδρε, για την πρόσκληση. I will...
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll do this in English.
Mentioned by predecessors, this is a very important topic, also very much at the heart of our protection response in Europe for UNHCR and across the world. I was asked to address the issue of protection challenges for unaccompanied children in Greece following the closure of the Western Balkan route. And I think maybe starting off with some figures would be important to remind ourselves of how many children are actually arriving in Europe by very dangerous means. In 2014, there were some 219,000 arrivals coming through the Mediterranean, and this was following the erection of fences in a couple of countries in Europe, notably Greece. And among them were 3,000 people who then perished, also many children. In 2015, we saw a dramatic rise in the number of people arriving across the Mediterranean, not just to Greece but also to Italy, although the majority arrived in Greece, 850,000 people, making a total of over 1 million people having arrived by boat through the Mediterranean, trying to reach Europe. And in that same year, there were an estimated 3,700 people that went missing, many of whom have likely perished. Now, the arrivals in Greece stand at 157,801 arrivals. And, of course, on the 20th of March, borders were closed on the Western Balkan route. And in the first 3 months, there were still high numbers of arrivals, but those arrivals have really gone down drastically. Just to remind you again of the nationalities of people who have been fleeing, the majority were Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis and Pakistanis, and just to remind you, of course, that these people actually come from countries that produce refugees, and the vast majority of the people arriving, therefore, we believe were in need of international protection, fleeing war, violence, persecution in their own countries. Also very important to say that 38% of those were children, and their numbers have been on the increase ever since. I already referred to the EU-Turkey statement and the implementation on the 20th of March, and we've seen a significant drop in arrivals, notably in Greece, from 2,200 in mid-February this year to 50 per day currently this month. We should not forget, though, the number of people that are currently in Greece, which reaches 54,000 people, migrants and refugees, predominantly refugees. And they're in a very dire situation. We've all seen the evacuation of Idomeni, and the government has tried to set up very quickly sites which didn't immediately respond, obviously, to standards for reception. And so people have been really struggling in those very sites, and the government is aware of this. They're doing everything they can to improve the situation. We're helping with that, also with partners on the ground. But of course it's not easy. It's a huge task they have before them. Again, among those people, there are many children who are affected, and so that's obviously of concern. We have, together with IOM, last Friday launched a refugee and migrant response plan, and we've made estimates of the situation that could arise if trends continue as they are now, and we're foreseeing that about 100,000 people may be in Greece by the end of this year who will be in need of protection and care. So that's a huge challenge that the Greeks will face. And we have based these numbers on the number of readmissions, numbers of relocation, family reunification, possibly under Dublin, assisted voluntary returns, but also people maybe still moving on irregularly. And just to make the point that we've seen that although the Western Balkan route is closed, we're seeing that smugglers are resorting to different routes. There's not yet a very big trend, but we're seeing more children arriving, for example, in Italy through the central Mediterranean route. But we also do see still large arrivals on the Serbian-Hungarian border currently. And the question is, where do these people come from? And among them are many children. The concern that we have, obviously, is that if these children are going through more dangerous routes with these smugglers and traffickers, they're really very, very much exposed. And it's very hard for us, therefore, as humanitarian organizations, to reach those children and try to address their needs and to care for them and protect them. And this, of course, also is a challenge for the authorities as well. Now, moving to the situation in Greece of unaccompanied children more in particular. At the moment, we have about 1,860 children who are registered, the majority being boys. And out of those, 1,200 are in accommodation, which means there's a gap of about 630 children not being accommodated, waiting on the waiting list. The majority, again, being boys, also quite a large number of children under 14. So we also see that trend that even younger or more and more younger children are actually coming. There are at the moment 187 children in reception facilities. Some of them are closed, and also we have 92 children currently in protective custody in police stations, which is very alarming. Reception capacity is very, very stretched. There's a higher demand on actually places at the moment. We all know that. And that's therefore, I think, one of the main problems at the moment that needs to be urgently addressed in Greece. As Zoe Sakliadou was already saying, indeed, also identification is a huge challenge. Children often prefer to stay under the radar, not least also because they fear that they might otherwise go into protective custody if there's no accommodation to them available. The problem also is that the guardianship system should be strengthened in Greece. There's not enough guardians, and that's not, I think, always not understandable because of the high numbers and the high needs. But that's also a serious issue that needs to be addressed. There's no best interest procedures currently, and also there's a problem with access to asylum procedures. There's a lot of focus currently on making the one-for-one deal with Turkey work, and so there's less attention currently for children who are not Syrians or eligible for relocation. And these children are very frustrated, obviously, in very dire circumstances, sitting in situations where they are in a closed environment, and we have seen, I think, the frustrations and some of the incidents in the hotspots, notably over the past few weeks, involving children. Then, just again, maybe this challenge of protective custody. Probably you know how the system in Greece works. The public prosecutor has to refer children to ECHA, which is the National Centre of Social Solidarity. But because there's a lack of places, children end up in protective custody or in these closed centres. Now, what UNHCR has been doing so far, we've been trying to create open spaces in existing reception sites as sort of an emergency measure to make sure that they're not, that they're safe. On a good note, on a positive note, the public prosecutor of the Supreme Court has announced that has given actually guidance to public prosecutors across the country and the police to avoid protective custody of children. So there are important steps being made. Yet again, the whole issue hinges on whether there's enough reception capacity available for these children. So what's UNHCR's role in Greece? We're providing information to children on asylum, on the asylum procedure in Greece, on family unification under Dublin, on relocation and options they may have. We're providing emergency response on arrival, and we're also supporting, we're giving humanitarian support for 50,000 persons of concern in the country. We also are involved in reception of 20,000 people for relocation, including also for vulnerable people, and we've received funds for that from the European Commission. Currently, we have been able to accommodate 128 unaccompanied children under that scheme, and we're also, as we speak, supporting the pre-registration of people who are in Greece and have not been able to register. And this we do together with the Greek government and with EASO. And this exercise has started on the 8th of June, and we have been so far able to identify 242 unaccompanied children, and we've also been able, with the authorities and experts on the ground, to do best interest assessments to see where best these children could go. We've also established with partners blue spots, blue dots. These are family support hubs, and they have been established for now at least in 7 places, 3 in Attica. There's 1 on Lesbos, and these are fully operational, and there's also 3 in northern Greece, which are semi-operational. The idea of these places, of these blue dots, or family support hubs, as we call them, is to bring together services for children, for families. And what we try to do there is we work with different people, different experts, child psychologists, but also the Red Cross and others, to try and provide services, for example, for family tracing. But also we provide psychosocial support. Those experts there provide social and psychological support and medical support. There's also child-friendly spaces there, spaces also for mothers and babies and toddlers to provide a safe environment for them. And these blue dots are very easily recognizable for everyone and bring together these services. So people can easily go there without having any shame And of course, also if there are any protection issues such as trafficking, people can go to these places and safely talk about them and then be referred if need be. A lot has been done, but the challenges are huge, in Greece in particular. So priorities for UNHCR in Greece are to continue to work with the Greek government and also to work with partners on the ground to try and improve identification of unaccompanied children, to establish proper referral pathways so that they get access to proper services. And I don't want to, and I cannot enough emphasize the need for psychosocial support that children need. We also advocate with the government, and we have discussions with them currently, to end child detention and to come up with alternatives. We also ensure legal information and counselling to children through our partners. And also we're trying, as I said, to address the current accommodation gap, which we think is the biggest issue as we speak. We're trying to support the setup of best interest procedures as well in Greece, support the guardianship system. There's currently an NGO, Metadrasis, yes, who has received funding for a pilot project for guardianship. So there are good initiatives on the way. Also, the issue of durable solutions for unaccompanied children is very much on our radar screen. Also, and that's actually why my colleague Xenia Passa couldn't be here today, we have made good progress also together with UNICEF and the Greek Ministry of Education to get access for children to education for refugee children, and this is also something that's on the way. Most children haven't been to formal education for quite a long time, not just in displacement, but also in their countries of origin in some occasions. Then I'd like to close with saying, yes, a lot has been done, but we need massive support for Greece. Greece cannot do it alone. Countries on the external borders cannot face the numbers of people arriving there alone. And as UNHCR, we've always been very strongly advocating for a coordinated European response, really built on solidarity and responsibility sharing. And I hope also that with the new package now on the table and the proposals for the common European asylum system and the reforms that are underway, that we can count on the members in this House to make sure that the best interests of children are ensured when those measures are being discussed in the negotiations. Thank you very much.
Ευχαριστούμε την κυρία Βόνκεμαν.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Vonkerman. Now, I'd like to also remind the speakers to keep to their speaking times, because we don't have very much time available to us. Eurochild is a large Europe-wide organization which exists in all member states of the European Union. It's an organization that can offer excellent conditions of protection for unaccompanied migrant children in particular, or refugee children in general. There are organizations like Eurochild that can provide conditions that are much better than the official state-provided protection. So I'll now give the floor to Katerina Nanu. She's responsible for Eurochild and is leading the campaigns at Eurochild. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to wish you a good morning, and I'd like to thank Mrs. Kuneva and Mr. Hadjigeorgiou for the invitation. It's excellent that we should have an opportunity to talk about the topic of child protection with you, because we certainly need to protect children much better. I'll continue in English.
And I will share with you today the experience of our members, which shared with us for the development of our paper, Turning the Tide for Children on the Move, which was published on Monday, the 20th of June, on the World Refugee Day. So Eurochild is advocating for the right of children, of all children deprived for parental care, to grow up in a family or community-based environment free from violence and with access to education, health and leisure, as all these are enshrined in the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child. children should be well informed and participate in the decisions of their lives. So for the development of these papers, for this paper, we asked our members from 7 European countries to share with us practices with regards to children's accommodation and integration from Greece, Italy, Serbia, Hungary, Austria, Germany and France. And today I will share with you practices from 4 countries, namely Greece, Italy, Serbia and Austria. And I have to tell you that the results are quite the same. So children in shelters, in camps, in institutions, and unaccompanied children, of course, do not trust the system or professionals most of the times, and they leave. Children disappear. So I will start with Greece, although a lot of things are also already mentioned, and I will try not to repeat what has already been said. I would just like to say that in Greece, children sometimes, yes, they do stay in specialized shelters for unaccompanied children. However, this is not always the case, and this seems that it is a matter of luck. At the moment, as already been mentioned, there are 600 children in the islands waiting to be placed in a shelter. Children also, of course, stay in camps, often with adults, and of course, hotspots have turned to detention centers. At the moment, there are approximately 22 camps in Greece, and the government builds more camps every week as the numbers are high and people need accommodation. And we should not forget families with toddlers and babies that are also in need of proper accommodation, which at the moment is not offered. Children that stay in shelters is not sure for how long, if or for how long they will stay at these shelters, as these shelters are open. And children do not always share their whereabouts, and they may leave whenever they want. So they might stay for a few nights or for months. Most of children do not want to stay in Greece, and you should respect this wish. Children leave the shelters and camps because, and one of the reasons is because family reunification might take up to 1 year, and they lose hope or trust. And this is something that doesn't happen only in Greece. This is something that happens in the majority of European countries, and this is something that we should really work on. So I will quickly move to Italy. So in Italy, according to the latest data, there are approximately 4,500 unaccompanied children at the moment. Children have to stay as a first stage in initial reception centers up to 90 days. And after that, they transfer in second reception. But this term is generally not respected, and children stay in these shelters for a long period of time, many times with adults. Hotspots also accommodate children with adults. So in Italy, there are 2,000 foster families prepared and trained to accommodate foster children. However, there is only 5.7% of children, unaccompanied children, placed in foster care. The rest of children are accommodated in state shelters and so on. Unaccompanied children are often left without a point of reference, meaning in absence of adequate support, including psychological assistance and legal protection. Of course, and it comes with no surprise, they don't trust the system, and they prefer to run away from the shelters and disappear. Under these circumstances, children are at risk of getting involved in criminal organizations for dealing drugs or for prostitution. In Serbia, unaccompanied children are accommodated together with adults in registration centers, transit centers, and so on. When they are transferred in reception centers, there are 2 in Serbia, specialized for unaccompanied children, they spend their time there in an unstructured way, with little information about where they are and what will happen to them. They are rarely consulted on their needs and wishes, and often there is no interpretation available. Social workers are not trained. And when they see a child being accompanied by an adult, they believe that the child is safe. So there is no need for further investigation. So case closed. Children are also threatened by the local boys accommodated in the same institution. So in the reception center, young offenders are also accommodated in the same place. So the local boys, have many times asked for their money or threatened to beat them and all these kind of threats. Very often the unaccompanied children simply use the opportunity and leave the reception center without protection and continue their journey on their own, and since the borders are closed, are exploited and abused by smugglers. In Austria, and this is the last country that I'm going to refer to, unaccompanied children are discriminated in various ways, and one of these is their accommodation. Unaccompanied children in Austria rarely get the chance to grow up in foster care families, and when they do, these families are not scrutinized in detail as it happens with the national foster care system. Also, children grow up in large-scale institutions, a practice that has stopped happening in Austria for at least 30 years now. There are 130 institutions for unaccompanied children, with often some of them having capacity of 50 children, while Austrian children deprived of parental care grow up in small group homes with capacity of 8 to 10 children. State institutions for unaccompanied children are, of course, in very bad state with lack of staff, 6 social workers for 100 children, and when the number of children decreases, of course, the number of social workers also decreases, and with no workers in night shifts. Also, there is a reception center which accommodates 1,000 children. Last summer it was 2,000 plus children, and with an inadequate care, lack of heating. Children can stay there for months and, of course, disappear. Echoing our members' voices, EU should guarantee that no detention of children takes place due to their status and that children should immediately stop living together with adults. We need to gain trust and confidence of these children. We believe that children's rights should be mainstreamed with the rights of all other children. More EU funds should be spent in children's short-term and long-term integration. Investing in those children today will help the children and will help the society to live together in a peaceful way. Thank you very much.
Ευχαριστούμε την κυρία Νάνο. Νομίζω...
Thank you very much, Mrs. Nano. I think we're all in agreement when it comes to the desire for European policy to prioritize the protection of children. I think that a fortress Europe necessarily violates those rights, the rights of children and all those people that are knocking on Europe's doors trying to come to us. I'd like to give the floor to Mrs. Pooley from UNICEF. She will talk to us about the protection of migrant children, and she will tell us about the difference between practice and theory. I'd like to thank the MEPs for this initiative. Thank you for inviting UNICEF, and I think this goes to show how seriously you're taking this extremely serious topic. Children don't know the places where they're traveling to, and they experience terrible things in the places where they are held. I will continue in English and tell you about the case of a 17-year-old Nigerian girl and who was lucky not to disappear.
In Nigeria, she stayed with an impoverished aunt who decided to marry her to a 40-year-old man. This man took me to his house and made me his house girl. I said to my aunt, "He's older than my dad." But she said, "If you don't marry this man, I will poison you." Then, it was then that I escaped. I didn't bring anything, just my shirt and the clothes I was wearing. She traveled first to Agadez, Niger, a transit point for migrants heading to Europe. From there, smugglers took her across the Sahara to Libya. So many people died in the desert. We saw dead bodies, skeletons. Peace said that when she finally reached Sabratha, a major embarkation point in Libya for the sea crossing to Italy, she and others were locked up in a windowless house for weeks. Our Libyan handlers wouldn't let us out. There was no water, no change of clothes, not enough food, she said, adding, There was fighting outside. I could hear shooting, and I was scared all the time. One day, she said, everyone started running to a boat. During the crossing, several people fell overboard and drowned, and others inside the boat fainted and died. I was even sitting down with dead bodies, and I was scared. Peace is now awaiting an asylum hearing and staying at a Rainbow House, a government-administered center in Sicily that provides shelter, food, and legal aid for unaccompanied refugee and migrant children. Over the last year, we have witnessed a rapid increase in the number of children refugees in Europe. Last June, 1 in 10 refugees and migrants was a child. By December, it was 1 in 3. Today, children make up nearly 40% of the 57,000 refugees and migrants stranded in Greece. In Italy, more than 9 out of 10 refugee and migrant children arriving are unaccompanied, including many girls. Last week, UNICEF released a child alert, bringing out the voices of children describing their dangerous stories to reach safety and protection in Europe. It describes the harrowing journey that children are making along the central Mediterranean route in the hope of finding safety or a better life in Europe. They are fleeing brutal violence, abject poverty, drought, forced early marriage, or lack of prospects and hope. Many do not survive the journey. The children's own stories captured in the Child Alert reveal the trauma they suffer getting to Europe and the risks they are forced to take along the route. The alert also reiterates the key principles that UNICEF is putting forward, provides information on some of the countries of origin, and provides what UNICEF, including through support from the EU, has been doing on the ground along the routes to support the protection and well-being of children on the move. Another study has been released also last week by UNICEF France and UNICEF UK, describing how children experience sexual exploitation, violence, and forced labour on a daily basis in the camps of northern France. They study, neither safe nor sound, looked at 60 children between the ages of 11 to 17 from Afghanistan, Egypt, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Syria, and Vietnam, living in 7 camps along the coast of the English Channel between January and April 2016. The children's testimonies paint a picture of abuse and tragedy, with cases of death, slavery, and forced criminal activity, such as assisting smugglers at ferry terminals. Sexual violence is a constant threat, including the sexual exploitation and rape of boys, and rape and forced prostitution of girls. Interviews with young women identified practices of exchanging sexual services for the promise of passage to the UK or to speed up their journey. Ladies and gentlemen, Europe and the world is not actually facing a migrant or refugee crisis. We are actually witnessing a child protection crisis. All children, no matter who they are or where they come from, need to be protected. For this to happen, we believe that child protection must be an integral part of the EU migration agenda. We also believe that every new EU policy should be assessed and monitored in terms of its impact on child rights. Every new proposal, from Dublin to the Reception Directive, from the Action Plan on Integration to Frontex new mandate, will touch the lives of children and impact on their rights in Europe and beyond. This is why, in the coming weeks and months, we need to work together closely to ensure that these new proposals, on paper and in practice, respect fundamental rights, including all the rights of children. Europe needs a robust and integrated child protection policy framework. Child protection must be an integral part of the EU's migration agenda, not an annex, not an afterthought. Child protection must be an integral part of EU migration policy and practice in Europe and beyond. A simple example where this could be materialized are the guiding principles on integrated child protection systems presented by the European Commission as a reflection paper exactly 1 year ago. These principles need to become an EU policy. They need to become binding, and they need to be monitored. That is the only way to ensure that they will be translated into action. EU needs to develop a comprehensive approach to protect children in migration in order to bridge the gap between child rights and migration policies and to break the silos between the different DGs, between EU institutions, international organizations and civil society. Ladies and gentlemen, every crisis, including today's children protection crisis, is an opportunity. It is our responsibility to use this opportunity and act. Inaction is not an option. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Pooley. Due to the restricted time available to us, could we move straight on to the second panel, and we will have time for questions at the end of that. So allow me to thank the speakers from the first panel very warmly, and I'd like to ask the speakers for our second panel debate to come up to the top table now and take their seats. Ladies and gentlemen, Zabina McNeil is next, and then we will have Mr. Nicolaides and Mr. Stavronidis and Mrs. Christidou joining us later. I'd like to inform everyone there's coffee in the room. You're very welcome to help yourselves to coffee.
Να μην τρέπεστε. Για εσάς είναι όλα.
να υπάρχει κάτι για λόγους. Έτσι. Λοιπόν, αγαπητοί φίλοι,
Dear friends, could I ask everyone to come back and focus on the topic that we've come to discuss today? I'll be chairing the second panel of today's seminar. In the Petitions Committee of the European Parliament, perhaps not everyone is aware of what the Petitions Committee does, but anyway, in the Petitions Committee we see a number of petitions from different organizations, some of them from the United Kingdom, and people keep asking about how to handle the issue of adoption. It's something that's handled in different ways in different member states, which is due to cultural differences that exist across the Union. And I won't actually say anything else about this. We've got speakers here to tell us about the situation. We have an expert from the United Kingdom, Mrs. McNeil, who supports children. And let me just make a few opening remarks before I give her the floor. In our culture, we have a number of agreements on adoption, but we had a number of cases that involved the parents who had deceased, or cases of extreme poverty in the child's family. In my own village, which I think would be representative of Cyprus, more generally speaking, when something tragic occurred, then the first family to take over duties of care would be given this duty, and quite often it would be one of the grandparents or a relative, an aunt or an uncle. And if it wasn't possible to find a relative to take responsibility for the child, a neighbour, a local person would be found to look after the child, so that the child could grow up in its own cultural environment. And if it wasn't possible to find anyone in the village itself, you would look to the next village to find carers for the child. And these cases did exist in my own village. I know of such situations where children had to be adopted under tragic circumstances. It was something that was part of daily life. It was just the way things worked, and we accepted that system. It was the way things were done. Now, of course, at some point it was felt that certain controls would have to be adopted. We would have to have state rules and regulations. But so with these words of introduction, I'd like to give you the floor.
Good morning, wonderful MEPs. I can't tell you how relieved I am and excited at the same time to be here. Kostadinka was one of the very first MEPs whom I ever spoke to when I came in March 2014, 2 years ago, with 30 parents from the UK who had put hopes on me getting their children back, either from care or from adoptive parents. To be here now, 2 years later, in this fabulous facility with translation, where people can talk in their own language across these problems, and to hear somebody from the Commission making positive comments, I can't tell you what it means to me. But also that I'm not just here as a petitioner today, but together with Belinda Mackenzie, who happens to be a Mackenzie friend by nature and name. Mackenzie friends have had to become a necessity in the UK because the legal profession has let parents down in secret family courts. That is at the nub of removing children and getting them to be adopted against their parents' wills. That's why 2 years after the petition that I presented at the time to abolish forced adoptions, I am now promoting a next petition and have contacted the Secretariat with a petition to stop the forced removals by social services. On top of it, I am here now as a public interest whistleblower. I face a criminal trial with imprisonment starting on July 11th. 5 days are scheduled. So what we've experienced in the UK is not just criminal activities and not just being covered up, but also public interest whistleblowers like me being stitched up, because I can assure you I am not a criminal. I am a mathematician and computer scientist. So if you could just click on so that we can race through the slides, because Zoe from the Commission has put into a nutshell everything that we have been experiencing first-hand. It is quite extraordinary and unbelievable. This is the tragedy that we've been observing, we as people who've been contacted by mothers, by parents themselves. Why? Because their children are not being heard. One of our allies has set up a charity called Children Screaming to be Heard. That is the reality. So all of these wonderful institutions, they talk about it and write about it, but the reality on the ground doesn't happen. Mind the gap is the big word always on tube stations between the papers and the realities on the ground. It is so tragic. I mean, in a way, I feel what's the point in talking about it? So I, as my last resort, published things online because it just wasn't worth talking anymore. I mean, when you go to prisons and see the mothers and know the mother whose child is taken at birth in prison, what do you want to do? And so every case is the worst, and every country thinks it's the worst. I mean, so at least I've now counted all of the MEPs who've expressed some interest, and it's nearly 300, so you can go through again. I wish I had a button to hear, but we can. I will make the slides available anyway on the site which is now called McNews, because as Mackenzie Friends we have become a news agency thanks to Dave, who has come. He sold his house and his car to buy a professional broadcasting camera so that we can spread the news. We believe it is truly the worst what's happening in the UK. One of the things that I've discovered is that the statistics that the government is publishing is only taking in half of the local authorities, 152 of 326. Why? The statistics are already bad. The trends are rising of children being taken into care, the children of being trafficked. The children are exactly what Zoe talked about, so I feel I don't need to repeat it, but I'm already way ahead of my. You're behind me with the slides. If you can just go on, please, because I've made it sort of sexy. I've petitioned not only the UK government. I've gone afterwards to the EU Parliament. We have appealed to the Commission. We've had a meeting with them. We've based our reports on UN reports. They are being ignored. The UN has criticised the UK government, has made 95 recommendations. I've written to the Children's Commissioner, what are you doing about the recommendations? All we are getting are what I call fob-off letters. It is just as bad as you cannot imagine it, so you can't believe it. All you can do is believe me, just like we believe the mothers. And, of course, the mainstream media. Yeah? I mean, that is believable. When things like the Daily Mail publish that London has become the world capital of child abuse, then that's hopefully believable. But that was printed 2 years ago. What difference has it made? Trends are rising. It is just unbelievable. Keep going, please. So when I first came, a Romanian MEP asked me, what on earth is a forced adoption? You know, are we in South America? Well, unfortunately, there are judges and judges and judges who legitimise in secret family courts what is happening after a child is being taken. Go on, please. So I've got the statistics, I've got the slides, and I've got them on the national level, on the local level, but this is the nub today. First the child gets removed, then this removal gets legitimized in the court. Then there are people who make money out of allowing contact between parents and children. So yes, Zoe, you asked the right questions. Who benefits? Who profits? Follow the money. So adoption is in a way minor. It's between 4 and 8% of all of the children who are in care. But abuse and sale are the purposes. I didn't think that was the reason either. And so now we have not only to educate the general public, but also MEPs and of course the whole of the Commission, hoping that we will make a difference. But God, what a process. So the mainstream media have made reports. There was a film made by Channel 4 and by BBC, also here at the Parliament, filming the chairman of the petition who says it's all perfectly against the fundamental charter. What difference does it make? We just have to keep going. That's all I can say and do, each in our own way. What else can we? What else is there? Keep going. And now it's getting serious, or tragic, or horrendous, or even more unbelievable. And I don't know whether Greece has been reached by this kind of story of this terrible Jimmy Savile, who is not alive anymore, but he has made at least the topic of child sexual abuse topical, and how he was even part of a satanic ring. But of course, at least he's dead. So you see, my time is nearly up. So let's just go on to the next level, please, because this is just once again the evidence that I'm not the alone. Satanic abuse is a phenomenon that it cannot be denied. The big questions are: what next? Where do we go from here? Who can do what? Who will implement what kind of monitoring procedures? I was thinking at some stage we need some ethics and justice panels where the MEPs and MPs and local counsellors and victims and parents get together on a local level. But please, anybody come up with solutions. Please, I have had enough of the problems. Thank you for listening and sharing my pain and suffering. Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ την κυρία Ζαμπίνα, πάρα πολύ. Περάσουμε αμέσως στην κυρία.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. McNeil. We now move to Mrs. Schiffer, where we'll hear from Mrs. Schiffer. She is a legal advisor from Sweden, and she will give us a bit more information about what the situation in Sweden looks like. We will hear from 3 further speakers after that. We only have half an hour left of interpretation time, so please do stick to your speaking time.
Thank you so much. Evcharisto, the Greek, very kind MIP members, inviting us from the Nordic Committee for Human Rights for the protection of family rights in the Nordic countries. And we had a petition number 2434/2014 admissible in February, and then I got invited by Mrs. Koneva Kostadinka to continue here today. Compulsory care and foster home placements against the will of the parents and the children are very prevalent in Sweden and in the Nordic countries. Sweden's 5th periodic report to the UN Child Committee states that 17,200 children were in foster homes or institutions in 2010. The Minister of Social Affairs affirmed that 32,200 children were in foster or institution care in 2014, which is an increase of 86% in 4 years. This is the result of the law with special provisions on the care of young persons, which most often leads to compulsory care on arbitrary grounds. The administrative courts are reluctant to diverge from the position of individual social workers and the social councils when a case regarding compulsory care is put before them. The administrative courts thereby neither comply with domestic law, which provides an obligation for the said courts to ensure that cases are properly and sufficiently investigated, nor do they comply with the European Convention on Human Rights, which guarantees the right to a fair trial and protection for private and family life. In addition to these issues of arbitrary legislation, which gives a mighty power to individual social workers, is producing disproportionately high number of children being removed from the care of their parents. And that can also be attributed to the economic incentives for the foster home industry. These economic incentives also result in the placing of children under the care of unsuitable foster parents, whereby children who the social workers claim are subjected to neglect are removed from their parents only to be placed in an environment where they become subjected to further and often more serious neglect. Sweden and the Nordic countries are very rich countries, and increasingly high numbers of placements are every year are made on investing the money for foster care instead of investing the money directly upon the families. The payment to the foster homes are extremely high. That gives income for unemployed who want to stay at home with their own children and opens the door for concealed adoptions to childless couples. The transfer of custody of foster children does not occur as yet very often in Sweden, but is proposed by the government's investigator for the new law with special provisions on the care of young persons coming up. And the investigator mentions the word adoption more than 300 times in the more than 600 pages long promemoria, new investigation from the government. The transfer of custody is a false adoption or a pseudo-adoption today, and for the children there are all the disadvantages of an adoption, but none of the advantages. For example, they do not become the heirs of their foster parents. The transfer of custody of the foster children from the parents cuts all ties between the children and their parents, and the parents lose all say in the lives of their own children. For the foster carers who are given custody of their foster children, they have all the advantages of an adoption, but none of the disadvantages. Yeah, I will do that. Yes. I will just mention some final words from a case won by a Swedish lawyer who was one of the inventors of this Nordic Committee of Human Rights. She won a case called the Eriksson case. Her name is Siv Westerberg. A Norwegian delegate in the European Commission, Mrs. Gro Hillestad Thune, declared in her concurring opinion, "Finally, I find it very surprising that under the Swedish system, a social council can in practice disregard and even obstruct the judgment of the Supreme Administrative Court without resulting sanction." Lawyers who work from a human rights point of view and take their work seriously to try to keep families together are penalized. The courts invariably reduce our fees that should be paid, and the lawyers can be dismissed from cases upon the recommendation of a social worker. The might and power of a social worker can just be, I will show in one example. My first case I had 5 years ago, that social workers put in grenades towards the mother to take her baby away. And this was even in a British newspaper. But as Sabine said, nothing happened. And the police, of course, said we did not use grenades. But the social workers had stated that in the official papers documents to the court. And that's why we could put it even in a paper. The police had been using pepper spray to get the mother lose her child. And this mother haven't seen her child in 3.5 years now. And there are others who haven't seen their children at all for 10 years. And this is like a high society standard country in one way. But I will say Sweden have two faces. We have an official, wonderful face helping all the world. But we have forgotten and neglected our own children taken care of by force. And this is a matter that is very hidden and no journalists write about it. Those who speak about it will get penalized in the matter that we get our fees reduced in the courts. But there are other ways to take care of us. But we believe for the future. We don't believe that this is the last word. We believe for a change, not even in our country, but in all our countries who have been speaking here. Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Ο κύριος Νικολαίδης είναι...
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Nicolidis.
Διεύθυνση ψυχικής υγείας, σας ευχαριστώ, αλλά...
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, I am a leader of the psychological department of the Child Health Institute in Greece. I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you. I will continue in English, which is seems to become the working language here.
I have prepared some sort of presentation, but due to limitations of time, I think I will probably have to skip most of the material just to stick to the main issues and to be, in a sense, communicative and interactive with other things that have been brought about in the discussion insofar. So, first of all, I think that we clinicians, researchers, practitioners in the field, we sense that family ties, family relations are changing. Family as a structure is changing. That is difficult to be communicated to administrators, journalists, decision makers, politicians, because we tend to think and plan for societies with the model of a family that is not there anymore. Family is changing. So this has to be taken into account. For that, I think one of the results of that was that percentages of children under care put into some sort of care is increasing in the developed world globally, but this does not necessarily entail institutionalization or separation of the child from the family. The percentages that we find are alarming indeed in terms of the percentages of self-reported exposure of children to violent or victimizing experiences. I'm glad and proud that we as an institute have been conducting the biggest insofar research for children's victimization in Europe and probably one of the biggest globally. And I must tell you that the percentages are quite alarming. Just to mention a few about Greece, it was in 9 countries, but just the Greek ones, we found that almost 4.5% of children had, in the 12-month period before the research, had at least one experience of exposure to sexual violence that included physical contact. That is 1 to 20 children. Everyone in this room knows 20 children in our family and social surroundings. It never occurs to us that one of these children is a victim of sexual abuse with physical contact. Now, we live in a society that's changing, and some of that is negative, of course. Second, I would like to just underline that once there is some sort of victimization, we know as scientists, sometimes politicians or journalists do not endorse this view, but we know as scientists that there is no good solution. There are less harmful solutions, but that makes a difference which one is to be chosen. And we know that because sometimes policymakers tend to represent an image of a carte postale, a pink carte postale with children that are brought to good and so forth. We know that once a family is violent and is dysfunctional, there won't be any good per se solution, but there would be less harmful solutions for the child. The third one is that 40 years of empirical research and also clinical experience have ranked the solutions that we have in hand in the following order. The first one is to keep the child with a biological family under supervision, support and intensive care. The second is some kinship foster or something else. The third would be foster or adoption or family-like environment. The fourth would be small group homes with less than 8, let's say, children, a number of children that could live in a normal family. And the worst solution is the institutions like the ones we have in Greece. And I'm afraid to say that in Greece, unlike Cyprus is a totally different issue, we have very large-scale institutions, very obsolete practices, institutions that have to be reformed yesterday, not today. And we know also that for some categories of children, like infants and toddlers, the harm that is being done if a child is placed in an institution is irreversible. And there is empirical evidence that led the United Nations 8 years ago to issue the global recommendation for all countries to abolish any kind of institutional care for children under 5 years old. Greece has not complied yet to that recommendation. And we know that all forms of care for children have cases in which they were applied in a wrongful way. But that's not an argument for revising the ranking that I just mentioned. For instance, before the Olympics of 2004, the Greek government, to evacuate the street from street children, applied an unspeakable program of foster care, giving 8, 9, 10 children to the same fosterer, and most of them were immigrants. Of course, they ended up placing foster children in traffickers, because those were the ones who appeared to ask for 10 children for foster care. But that's not to be blamed for the model of foster care. That's the way they applied that. And given that experience, the fact that the Greek government has not any kind of structure for foster care of unaccompanied minors, because of that experience, is a bizarre and a problem in the policies that are applied. Have I 1 minute more to conclude, and I'll just skip the slide at all. It's not only placement, because we know that the game mainly is played in the new instances, the new cases that develop. So the most important thing is, do you have a comprehensive system of community-based primary social care, child protection services in order to identify early enough the cases of families with children that have hardships and upbringing them, to provide them with support and supervision in order for things not getting worse, so that you don't have a child that has to be placed somewhere else. In Greece we have no child protection services. And this, unlike Cyprus, where there is a totally different reality, and I assure you for that. I'm sure there are problems in many countries, but in Greece we have no child protection system as a comprehensive system, and that is the core problem. Last but not least, in the public rhetoric, at least in Greece, we tend to reproduce for child protection a totally backwards model of child protection, both for NGOs and for politicians, leaders of ministries or public agencies, of the ones that take care of children that somebody else cannot raise, because they are incompetent, because they are in need, because of whatsoever. And so child protection is conceived as those who take the children of those who cannot raise them and raise them instead of them. We have to change this public perception, because this is crucial to change that into child protection being someone who helps a family that has problems and dysfunctions, real ones, helps them to keep and raise their own child by themselves with support and supervision. Thank you very much.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ τον κύριο Νικολαίδη. Ο επόμενος λόγος...
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Nikolaidis. Mr. Laminidis is the next speaker. He's from the University of Cyprus and looks at psychological development. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you to Mrs. Kuneva and Mr. Hatzigeorgi for the invitation. And I will move straight to my presentation and I will go straight to the heart of the topic. Please, I beg you for your understanding. I had prepared a text in Greek and now I've been told that the working language of the meeting will be in English. So I will try to translate my own text. So I'll do it in English, though the speaker is welcome to speak Greek if he so wishes.
I was participating as a researcher in one of the first attempts to estimate the prevalence of sexual abuse among minors in the countries of the European Union. I remember the sessions, the meetings we had, the expert meetings, in an effort to create a common framework of understanding this problem. In short, I can tell you that from this project, a number came up, a scary number, I can tell you, that shook many of us in our societies, in our European countries. That number was 1 in 10. In other words, either with some lower numbers in some countries or with some higher numbers in some other countries, we learned that about 1 in 10% of children and adolescents would experience at least one form of experience of sexual abuse, not necessarily physical, until they become grown-ups. Think about it. The truth is that this 1 in 10 was somewhat sounding scary initially in our ears, especially as an exaggeration. It seemed hard to accept that so many children, because it's about children, would experience such a traumatic experience before they enter adulthood. Now, it was also during that period that I came against with the concept of dark epidemic, or if you prefer, the notion of hidden numbers. Think about this, ladies and gentlemen. Think about this. If we somehow find this today in Cyprus, 100 children that have been sexually abused, from those 100 children, not even half of them, their parents will ever know about what happened to them. Now, even from those children, only half of them would have some sort of report. And from those children, not even half of those will have a case at the police. And from those children, not even half of those will have a case at court. And from there, only a handful of cases will be eventually even tried and convicted. Actually, to make things worse, I can tell you that in that project 10 years ago, we found that in Cyprus, during a couple of years, we had only 1 or 2 convictions. Basically, we were saying to the world that we had no problem, which was a big lie. I guess you can see by now why I chose the title of Dark Epidemic. But where did that European effort end? It was actually a decade ago. There were campaigns of awareness, sensitization, conferences, discussions, panel discussions. I guess maybe some modernizations of some legislation. We had to do that, and it was okay that we did. But they should have had an effect, right? We should have been today, 10 years later, somewhere better, not to talk about that shameful 1 in 10. Well, the truth is that in the years that followed, I had stopped my involvement in this line of research. Other forms of abuse if I have a couple of minutes I will speak about them, were in the focal of my attention. Now, where are we today? 2 years ago, I learned that some good colleagues of mine at my university were involved actively in a new European study in order to measure again the prevalence, the extent of the problem of sexual abuse among minors in Europe. I was expecting with great interest the findings of this new collective effort. Actually, recently, when the researchers had the announcement of their first findings, this new team of European investigators had also announced the slogan with which they would renew a campaign of awareness among the European societies. Many of you here may have already heard that slogan. It's 1 in 5. In this number, we have our collective failure as citizens of the United Europe. Now, we no longer talk about this shocking 10% of the first decade of the new millennium, but we're talking about 20%. 1 in 5 children will be sexually abused in some form before they enter adulthood. So it is a true epidemic, and it becomes even worse when you reflect on this hidden, this dark dimension. Of course, as well, if we contemplate the serious consequence that comes along with the victims of abuse. Let me talk to you as a psychologist. Depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders, and many more. And all this in a period of their lives that are still under development, the basic components of their personality, their social, their cognitive, and their emotional functioning. It's not actually by mistake that many of the cases of suicidal ideation and even suicide attempts comes from victims of sexual abuse. I guess I don't have to repeat the size of our collective failure. I know that time is very limited, so let me close with this, because we need not only to describe the problem, but to offer some way out. I realize that complex social issues demand, unfortunately, complex solutions, a combination of interventions from the legal, psychological, educational, family, and social toolbox. And yet, for all this to work, we need something more. We need timely prevention. Let me refer, and I close with that, a discussion that I had with this issue with Professor David Farrington recently. For many of us, actually, one of the leading experts in terms of criminology in Europe. His opinion, and mine actually as well, stands on this basic principle: prevention from the early stages, prevention in the preschool years, with scientifically founded interventions, with scientifically founded evidence-based programs that will allow the strengthening, the empowerment of the child and their social context. And those, because we live in dark times, not only in dark epidemics, but in dark financial times as well, where everything has to be accounted in terms of money. Those of them that think that the financial aspect of such an approach is unbearable in our times, I can only say this. For every euro that a country spends in good prevention, I repeat, in good, solid prevention, that country saves up multiple expenses that they will make in their future costs that unfortunately comes with delayed response to such problems and the collateral damages. Thank you, and I'm sorry if I took a few minutes more from your time.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ τον Παναγιώτη Σταυρινίδη. Πριν δώσω τον λόγο στην τελευταία...
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stavronidis. I'd like to give the floor to Mrs. Melpo Christie, who's a social worker at the Smile of the Child organization in Greece, and I would ask to be given just a little bit more time for the last speaker to take the floor. I'd like to thank you very much indeed. I would like to speak in Greek, if I may, because it will save a bit of time and we don't have too much time left. I had originally prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but I'll try to skip through it a bit more quickly. I'm going to talk about children that face dangerous situations and the work of NGOs. Social marginalization of children does lead to situations coming about whereby children end up in dangerous situations facing risks. There are cases revealed on a daily basis where we realize just how important it is for us to create a better world for these children. Our organization, the Smile of the Child, has been actively operating for 3 decades to protect children that are exposed to dangerous and hazardous situations. We want to break the cycle so that this violence does not perpetuate itself in the lives of these children. We try to take preventive action and rehabilitate children that have become victims of abuse, victims of people trafficking. We take care of unaccompanied minors. We look after children that are really struggling to survive and are living in extreme poverty. In 2015, we compiled data in our organization regarding the number of cases that were uncovered of serious abuse. 988 cases to be precise. 1,975 children involved in total. Just over half of the cases involved boys, and in some cases it was impossible to tell exactly what age the child was or the gender of the child. 75% of these children were between the age of 0 to 12 years, so under the age of 12, and in 46% the cases involved physical abuse. Neglect affected about 16.1%. And the other forms of abuse follow on from that: sexual abuse, psychological abuse, exploitation, and the other cases that are listed on the slide. (128) cases were lodged for the accommodation of children. 160 children were involved, and the competent authorities were ordered to remove children from their parents for causes of neglect, abandonment, physical abuse, sexual abuse, abuse and neglect, and economic inability to care for the children in an adequate way. Our organization currently runs 11 homes, which houses 324 children. 46 of those have had to leave their homes, or were housed only for 1 year in total. In some cases, these children became adults, and in other cases they moved back to live with their parents or found other forms of protection. As I was saying earlier, the 7 to 12-year-old bracket applies to 37% children. 0 to 6 was 26% of the cases. When we look at the 7 to 12 age bracket, there were very serious cases of neglect or abuse that were registered. A very large proportion of the cases involved Greek children, more than 70%, but we also cared for other children from other EU member states and other countries, notably involving children that travelled to Greece. Mostly the cases involved children from families with a low socio-economic status. Very rarely do we have cases involving children from high socio-economic backgrounds. We have a number of cases and indications from 2015 that where we tried to house children with families. 3,300 families roughly needed support, affecting some 13,000 children in total. Now, these were new cases, so given the fact that we don't have very much time today, I just wanted to say in conclusion that I can agree with a lot of what's been said by previous speakers. Just very briefly on our organisation and the support that we provide to children, we were able to establish that in different structures, within those structures, it's possible to protect the rights of children. We've been able to move towards establishing a national plan for protection of children, and we are trying to identify the social risk factors that children are exposed to. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ όλους, πρωτίστως τους διερμηνείς που ήταν εδώ.
Well, thank you very much to the speakers, and I'd now like to give the floor to Mrs. Kuneva to wrap up the debate. Let me thank you all very warmly indeed, and I'd like to thank the staff who put together this event. We've received a lot of information today.
I'd also like to thank you very much as well. I'd like to thank you for the excellent cooperation we've had between all those involved. And I'd like to thank all of the speakers who've taken the time to come and speak to us today. We've received a lot of important information. We've got plenty of data, plenty of information, ideas that we can put into our work. And a number of measures have been proposed as well, which I think are very interesting. I think it's a shame that we have to close our debate at this point. But unfortunately, the interpreters won't be able to stay with us any longer. What I would hope, however, is that we should be able to get more interpreters available in the future. I think it's really very much a shame that we don't have them for any longer today. Of course, we should be able to continue our debate among ourselves. I'm sure that there's going to be an opportunity to continue our dialogue. So anyone who's interested can raise those issues outside the room. We've got a brief reception outside with some snacks to eat, and I hope that you'll take advantage of that. I'd like to thank all of the members who've come. And I'd like to thank you all for the interest that you've shown in this very important topic.
Να συγχαρώ όσους αγωνίζονται για αυτή τη σπουδαία υπόθεση που αφορά τα παιδιά όλου του.
I just wanted to say that I'd like to really express my appreciation for all of those people who've been working so hard on this topic. Thank you very much. I'd like to close today's session. Thanks to all concerned. Thank you.